Well, this morning, we're so pleased to have Kurt Terrani, who's the Senior Vice President of UltraSafe Nuclear Corporation, the core division. I think back in March, his company made an announcement that they were setting up a fuel pilot facility out at the K-25 site. And we wanted to hear what was going on. There's a lot of nuclear news locally these days that's pretty exciting. Kurt came to the laboratory after he got his PhD at Berkeley. I believe you were a Weinberg fellow. And if you're not familiar with that program, that's a program that the lab started, I don't know, more than 10 years ago to really bring superstars to the laboratory. A special package of incentives for the individual that takes those positions. So he was a senior scientist at Ornell until I think April of last year.
February of 21.
February of 21. Okay, when he joined U.S. UltraSafe Nuclear Corporation. And we're so glad to have you here, Kurt, to talk about this. It's exciting happenings right now. Thanks to you.
Hey. Sure, I'll go to this one. Do you want to go full screen? We can see the slides a little better. Oh, really? Okay. I thought it handles it, but that's okay. All right. So, hey, good morning to all of you, and thank you for having me here. I know some of you, and it's a pleasure to be here. Again, as Jim kindly introduced me, I'm Kurt Terrani. I'm talking about UltraSafe Nuclear Corporation. See our motto there, reliable energy anywhere. Let's go to the next slide. The purpose is, as Jim said, is for me to tell you about what UltraSafe Nuclear is and what are we doing here in Oak Ridge. And I'll tie it into the local history here, okay? Let's go to the next slide, please. We are an advanced energy technology company based on nuclear microreactors. Closer to the microphone, you got it. So we are an advanced nuclear energy. We are an energy technology company focused on nuclear microreactors. Microreactors. We're not talking about a gigawatt of heat and electricity. We're talking about just a few megawatts, right? And our technology is high temperature gas-cooled reactors, high temperature gas-cooled reactors that are microreactors. Our flagship products are the micro-modular reactor. These are reactors that you can ship to a site, you can build and deploy in a matter of like 30 or 35 weeks, not 15 years and 500% over budget. You know, these are small systems, and you can deploy. You don't need $20 billion, you need tens of millions of dollars to deploy them. Our first project is in Canada, actually, in Chalk River. We have a joint venture with Ontario Power Generation. That's similar to TVA. It's a big utility in Canada. So that's our first project. And our follow-on projects are in the United States, in Illinois, in Idaho. There's a lot of studies going on in Alaska and elsewhere, okay? So besides this land-based microreactors, we kind of use the same principles and fundamentals of our technology to develop reactors that are not for Earth, they're for space. So either nuclear thermal propulsion, where you're using the heat generated from a reactor core to heat a gas and launch a rocket instead of burning chemicals, or reactors to provide you power on a lunar surface or Mars. It turns out the hydroelectric dams aren't working so well up there. So that's kind of the gist of the reactor products, right? So this is all just concepts, but you have to, I'm going to tell you about a little bit of our philosophy and what do we do, especially in my area, which is fuel. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, obviously you probably can't read this and you don't need to read this. Let me tell you what our philosophy is. The name of the company is called UltraSafe. And basically, if you take a look at the nuclear reactors that exist today commercially, there's about 400 of them around the world. There's about just shy of 100 in the United States. And these things are based on Rickover's water-based reactor, whether you like it or not. There's been a lot of reactors been built and operated here in Oak Ridge in the early what Alvin Weinberg called the first nuclear era, a lot of different salt and gas and all these other cool systems. But we ended up using Hyman Rickover's reactor that he deployed for his submarine. These are gargantuan machines. They are, again, about 3 gigawatts. That's a big number of heat, and about 1 gigawatt of electricity. And so they have this awesome power. They have a very large power density, which means they are within a small volume, they're generating a lot of power. And so this is, it made economic sense back then. They called it economics of scale. And so when you pack this much energy into a small volume, when something goes wrong, it really goes wrong. And let me give you an analogy. So imagine, I don't know if you guys watch Game of Thrones, but everybody knows the concept of a dragon. It's a very powerful, mythical beast. So imagine we all go, the Rotary Club next week, you guys go slay a dragon. And you're like, hey, you know what? This thing is very powerful. Let's harvest its power. And then you put it in a cage. And Jim is like, you know what, folks? This is tricky if this dragon gets out. Let's put another cage around it. So we keep putting cages around the dragon or make ourselves feel really good that this beast is not going to get out. But it does eventually get out, right? So we can look at history, but the most recent one was the Fukushima reactor. These are folks that, as far as we were all concerned, they did everything right. But an act of nature comes in and the dragon gets out. When a dragon gets out, it's pretty messy. So our philosophy is that instead of putting a dragon inside of a bunch of cages, let's get a hamster, put it in there, right? Hence the microreactor. And basically the consequences of the hamster getting out is the probability is very low and the consequences are very low. And that's our philosophy in ultra-safe nuclear. Low power density, highly safe systems. Safety not because Kurt knows when to press the button really fast, or we have a pump that's going to do this, or we have a valve that's going to do this. No, we are safe because of gravity, because mass gets sucked towards the earth. We are safe because warm fluid rises to the top. So laws of nature are the design principles, not some fancy engineered loop, right? So that's kind of our philosophy to design, and hence the ultra-safe philosophy. On top of that, we have a fuel form, which I'm responsible for making. And that fuel form is what we call the fully ceramic microencapsulated fuel. Fully ceramic microencapsulated fuel. We take small spheres of uranium, we coat them with multiple coating layers, and then we take those small beads of encapsulated uranium particles inside of tank armor, which is silicon carbide. It's a really strong ceramic. And so by encapsulating and having these multiple barriers to release, we have a very safe fuel operating inside of a very safe reactor. And that's our principle. And that's what we believe makes these technologies viable and economic, when you don't have to spend all that money pouring all that concrete and fence and safety systems. And I'll tell you about the fuel a lot more in a little bit. Let's go to the next slide. I wonder if you can play this. Yeah, it looks like it.
This little guy packs a big punch. It's the size of a walnut and can release the same energy as 2,000 liters of diesel. Not bad for a rock. With so much power comes great responsibility. For as fission reactions take place, the uranium fuel is slowly transforming into roughly 1/3 of the periodic table as solids and gases. These are the radioactive fission products that make nuclear waste dangerous, and they must be permanently contained. So beyond generating heat, the fuel needs to trap the fission products in place. In FCM fuel, millimeter-sized bits of uranium are trapped in tiny ceramic pressure vessels that can withstand extreme temperatures and radiation. These particles are then encased within a fully dense silicon carbide matrix, somewhat like encasing the fuel in a diamond. Silicon carbide is used for tank armor and has an extremely high melting temperature, far beyond the heat generated by the fuel. It is particularly resilient to radiation and does not chemically interact with other materials in the reactor. If the pellet is fractured, the fuel particles can remain intact as they are smaller than the smallest fragments. The core is assembled with enough fuel and graphite blocks to produce heat through self-sustaining fission reactions. This fully ceramic core has the lowest power density of any commercial reactor ever. allowing it to easily dissipate excess heat. To power it up, control rods are withdrawn and the fission reactions can begin. But these reactions slow down at higher temperatures. So to keep producing power, the reactor has to be cooled. If cooling stops, the reactor automatically shuts down. Helium carries heat out of the nuclear core. It is a harmless, noble gas, completely unreactive and stable. And while somewhat inefficient, it is the safest coolant available. Now, the problem with nuclear fuel is that it continues to generate heat even after the reactor is powered down. It will continue to generate roughly 10% of the original heat for hours and days to come. And if it's not cooled, that heat will pile up. The challenge with nuclear has always been to ensure the reactor does not damage itself when cooling is lost. The MMR can dissipate all excess heat passively and harmlessly into the environment in any scenario. Like a warm pot, it cools off just by sitting there. No moving parts or fluids, no operator actions, just simple cooling by conduction and glowing. This means the reactor can tolerate extreme conditions and survive undamaged. It can deal with complete withdrawal of all control rods. It doesn't need power to operate cooling pumps or emergency systems. The MMR doesn't even need coolant or natural interflow to stay at safe temperatures. It doesn't really need very much at all. Instead of designing elaborate safety systems against particular scenarios, we've designed a reactor that is inherently safe no matter the events. The MMR harnesses the fuel's formidable energy while fully containing its radioactivity during all encountered conditions, be it normal operations, worst-case failures, or permanent storage. This is ultra-safe, the new standard for nuclear safety.
Okay, great. So I think that told you, but kind of repeated what I told you. I hope that resonated. Let's skip these reactor slides. That's boring. Let's get to the fuel. So let's go to slide number 27. Yeah. Okay. So this is, you heard about the philosophy, you heard about the fuel. So what is this fuel? How do we make it? Well, we are standing on the shoulders of giants here. This is not an invention that, we came up with last month. We are using this fuel particle. It's called Trisol Fuel particle. It is an idea that came about in the late 50s, and folks were making it here in Oak Ridge in the late 50s, early 60s. And so that technology has been in Oak Ridge for decades. And when I joined ORNL in 2010, I was working in the group that had been carrying this technology for decades. They are Trisol fuel particles. They are a common motif theme. They keep popping up in a lot of advanced reactors. So the Kairos reactor or a lot of other reactors are using the same fuel particle. How do we make it? Well, we start on the left, we get some uranium powder, we dissolve it in acid, we mix it with a bunch of other organics, we drip it through a nozzle, we make these gels. And then we cook the gels inside of a furnace, we make them nice and dense, we put them inside of another furnace, we coat them with these coating layers that you heard about. And then where our technology is kind of unique is where we take this particle and put it inside of the silicon carbide. How do we do that? Well, we use additive manufacturing, 3D printing, believe it or not, for that. And so I used to work with Alan Leiby and a lot of team at ORNL's manufacturing demonstration facility to develop this. So that you may see a box on the top right is where we are 3D printing silicon carbide and making these cups that eventually host the fuel particles and make our elements. If you go to the next slide, this is talks about one of the two facilities that my division operates. This is our Advanced Ceramics Manufacturing Facility, ACM. This is a non-radiological facility where we're doing all the silicon carbide 3D printing. Where are we doing that? We're doing that in Salt Lake City, Utah. We've made the investments and installed a lot of equipment over there to do the non-radiological part of our fuel manufacturing. If you go to the next slide, you'll see what we're doing here in Oak Ridge, which is all those steps that I talked to you about. Getting uranium, dissolving it in acid, cooking it, coating it, putting it inside of the silicon carbide. And we're doing this in the old K25, which is now called East Tennessee Technology Park. We came out here and purchased, so a lot of folks think we're operating out of DOE. We are not. There's a lot of folks that are doing that, but this is a genuinely and wholly private entity. We purchased land in K25, we purchased a building, we are doing a major construction over there. You may see some of the pictures with our folks standing and hard hats, et cetera, in our facility. And we are installing all of the support equipment to be able to then install all of these equipment for manufacturing of the fuel. I tell you, it's a full contact sport. I mean, with today's supply chain problems and things like that, it has been extremely stressful and difficult affair. But nonetheless, we've been making pretty good progress, and we are going operational in this facility in summer. We've already received all of our licenses from the state, air permits, water discharge, radiological permits, and we'll be doing a uranium processing right down the road from you here. This is my last slide, and this is what I kind of wanted to mention. We talked about how all the reactors are water-based reactors, and we are developing this advanced high-temperature gas-cooled reactor. Well, these are not new ideas. The idea of a high-temperature gas-cooled reactor was proposed by Farrington Daniels in 1944, and people were working on it in Oak Ridge. That's the report from McCullough in 1946. Right? So anybody comes to you and say, "Oh, this is brand new stuff," they're making stuff up. Again, there's a lot of work's been done in the past. These pictures of those particles, they're not particularly pretty. They're from 1960. Again, this is the work out of R&L where people were making small spheres of uranium and coating them. And again, what we're using is an evolution of those technologies. When I came in 2010, I came to Oak Ridge to start actually working on this fuel concept. So our fuel idea is actually an idea that was developed and patented partly by ORNL, Oak Ridge National Lab. And UltraSafe Nuclear as a company, we licensed that technology to be able to use it for our reactor. The idea of how we use additive manufacturing to make the fuel was also a technology that was developed in Oak Ridge National Lab. And I was one of the inventors, and we licensed that technology and took it to the private sector to actually deploy it. So there's a lot of history to this region, and there's a lot of good reason why we're here. It turns out if you want to do uranium processing and radiological work, it's hard to find it in Silicon Valley, San Francisco Bay Area. There isn't the workforce, there isn't the network there, and there isn't the culture to support it. So we're really fortunate to be here, to be able to leverage, just the community and all the talent, the relevant talent that's here. And we hope to continue building and expanding from here. So I think I'll stop here and maybe we'll get into some Q&A.
Kurt, if anybody has a question, will you repeat it too? So,
You bet. Please.
How big are the pellets?
The pellets are exactly to say that they're 21 millimeter in diameter and 30 millimeter tall. That gentleman in the back. I'm sorry. Sorry, your question was how big are the pellets? I should repeat it. Sorry, gentleman in the back.
Where do you get the helium from? Is there a potential shortage of helium?
Yeah, there is a potential shortage of helium. It used to be a lot more available than it is now. You can still commercially purchase it. We purchase it commercially for some of our operations here. The exact answer to your question about where we're getting the helium, I have to ask my plant people, but it is becoming more expensive and less available, but it's not unavailable. Yes, sir.
What's the fuel cycle life?
Excellent question.
And then afterwards, what do you do with fuel?
Excellent question. So the question is, what is the fuel cycle life and what do you do with the fuel after it comes out? Well, I didn't get into this, but really our reactors are not the conventional reactors. They're nuclear batteries. So we load that core with about 2 metric tons of uranium, and that guy runs for 20 years. 20 years. We never open it. We never add fuel to it. So the reactors today, every 18 months, every 24 months, you lift it up, you keep putting more fuel in there. Why? Because remember, we're running this guy at low power. So it's like buying a 9-volt battery and just running it really slowly. So the fuel cycle is a 20-year fuel cycle. And the fuel, because it's encapsulated so much in so many different barriers, it's a repository-ready fuel form. So it's extremely difficult for reprocessing. There's almost no chemical way of reprocessing it. So you have to crush it and grind it. It's very difficult to reprocess. And it's got already all these barriers to release. So we think it's a repository-ready fuel for meant to go directly to a repository. When you get into that, well, you know, the different countries, different paradigms. In Canada, there's one method of disposal. In the US, for now, you just need to store it next to the reactor until the repository problem is solved. Yes, sir.
In Oak Ridge, the gas food reactor is called EGCR.
Yeah.
Experimental gas food reactor. But it had the reputation that back in the day, even God couldn't run it.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, this has improved quite a bit in the meantime. My question is, could these be made even smaller so that you could run, say, the local, well, let's
Sure.
say, apply to the shopping center?
Fantastic question. So the question was, you know, the EGCR, what we used to call the rust bucket over there. And so they were difficult, they were large. And so has the technology improved that you can deploy them small in various locations? So the answer is yes. And this goes back to that safety philosophy and design, right? So there's this thing called EPZ, Emergency Planning Zone. And for a big reactor, you got a 10-mile or 5-mile radius that you do emergency planning zone and you don't want folks there. If you have a reactor that you can convince the regulator that, hey, I don't have a dragon in there, I got a hamster in there, and a hamster can only run 10 feet, your EPZ is small, right? So that means you can deploy it next to a tribal community in Canada. You can deploy it next to a chemical plant in Poland. You can deploy it next to a community in Wyoming. So the idea is not to have one large reactor generating and then distributed long distances, is to have them deployed right very close to where you actually need it. And so, yes, that's exactly what we were trying to do, and that's what makes it economic.
Let's have one more question, okay?
I think.
When do you deploy? When do you expect to deploy?
Our first deployment in Canada is scheduled for 2026, and the deployments in the US are 2027 and beyond, if all goes well.
Ellen, last question.
Speaking of regulators, how is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission doing for modifying the regulations and technologies they have?
Sure.
Many of us know their regulatory structure is based on what
Absolutely, yeah.
on large scale, and they ask all sorts of questions.
Yeah, no, so Ellen's question is that how is NRC handling these new technologies? And you're absolutely right. If you get into the details of the regulation, you know, Part 50 and all that, it's very specific to that water-based technology. So there's a lot of challenges for that. They recognize it, they have recognized it. They do have reg guides and things like that on how you approach a regulatory paradigm for these reactors. They are very much open, and this is the thing of what makes nuclear regulatory licensing process sometimes challenging. It's not about following a well-defined recipe. It's about presenting your methodology and getting buy-in that, hey, this methodology works, this approach works. So I tell you, I think I've always been very successful working with NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I think you need to start talking to them early. You need to talk to them often. And you need to be open to their feedback. And I think if you try to go and force your way in there, they'll slam it, as they did with one of the entities recently. But I think they are very much open to it, and they recognize the need to license these systems. So you just need to interact with them early on and leverage the existing regulatory guidances designed for these advanced systems.
Well, Kurt, thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody has any other questions? So Kurt has a few minutes too afterwards. If anyone has any more questions,